and when we get to the chat, we won't be recording anymore. Okay, so welcome and thank you for being interested in and joining me for one of our Babcock Mathematics research talks. This is our 6th one, and we're starting to build up a really nice library of talks, all of which can be accessed through our YouTube channel. So today I'm going to talk about the use of colour to support understanding in mathematics. I'm Dr. Ruth Trundley. I'm a maths advisor for Babcock LDP based in Devon, but I sort of work with teachers across the southwest, across the country and beyond. And this is from a really small scale research project. A lot of these talks are around very small scale research projects. It's sort of the purpose really. And this is one that we ran a couple of years ago. And I want to start off by giving the background to it. Why have a research project around colour? One of the things that research seems to show is that colour can aid in learning. So there's quite a bit of research around this, and interestingly here, and this is one of the bits of research that we looked at, Valenote, who drew on Cruikshank here, who talks about the fact that colour enhances motivation, attention, and long-term and short-term memory, which that's quite a list of things that colour is potentially adding to. So I'm going to say potentially, and I'm going to give you where my interest came from, which kind of sparked this little project that we ran. So one of the things is that we know that commercially produced mathematical resources are often brightly coloured, and some of them, the colour is actually part of the structure. So there's two classic ones there, Cuisenaire rods and Numicon plates, and there the colour is part of the structure of those resources. We're not going to look at those today. There's a lot to explore in those resources, but the structure and the intent with the colour is a bit more obvious, and there's relationships between different parts. So the blues and the greens in both the Numicon and the Cuisenaire rods, there's a relationship between those rods or those plates. Then there's things like base 10, where again colour might be built into the structure. So on the left you've got the 1s are yellow, the 10 rods are green, the 100 plates are blue, and then the 1000 cubes are red. Or you might have all one colour. So this is one of the things where I started to be interested, because I was finding I was working with teachers and working in schools with learners where sometimes you had equipment that was all one colour, and sometimes you had these different colours, but also sometimes what you had was a little bit of a mixture, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So again, place value arrow cards, you know, some of them have got colour, and that's reflecting the structure. The 1s are green, the 10s are yellow, the reds are the 100s, but they're not always coloured. And I found myself in my resources choosing between these and making a conscious decision. And I started to consciously, with the arrow cards, decide that I only wanted to use the ones where they were all white. And that made me sort of stop and think about why I was making that decision, and then want to explore that and to look at the reason why you might use colour or you might not want to use colour. And that also matches with place value counters. This is one of the things, though, that was one of my sort of real pet peeves, if you like, was finding when I was going to work with children in schools and asking to use a resource, and a resource particularly where it was sort of objects for counting, but also it might have been part of one of those structured resources. So those cubes might have been the tray of cubes I was offered to work with as part of base 10, where the colours are just all mixed together. So the counters are just all mixed together. The multi-link are just all mixed together. And I realised that where I was wanting to use the resource to show something and to expose something about structure, potentially colour might be getting in the way. And again, I found myself with my own resources sorting them into separate colours. So I've got my multi-link in sticks of each colour. So I decide I either give you a single colour or I might give you two colours, but there is a definite decision I'm making around colour. But again, I wanted to examine that and to work with some teachers and with some children to find out whether that was relevant at all and why it might be important. And then I had a little bit of an experience working with a school. We were working on a lesson research cycle, and we were looking at introducing the very early stages of thinking about sort of multiplication, and just about equal groups was really what we were looking at. So we had a situation where we were planning together, and what we didn't do, and it was a big mistake, was we didn't get the resource out that we were talking about, because we thought we had a shared understanding of it. We thought when we were talking about it, we all knew what we were talking about, that we're talking about the same thing. And we decided that we were going to use counters. So most of the children were going to use counters. The context for the session was seats on a spaceship, I think it was, but it was definitely about putting seats in equal rows. And there was going to be a group of children doing it with chairs, whilst other children sort of modelled it with counters, and then we would be able to have conversations about what was going on. And that was the intention of what was planned. But I want to go back to the first part of that slide and just say that one of the things that adults might not see when they're looking at resources is they might not even notice that there's a mixture of colour. They're not attending to the colour, so they don't think about necessarily what that colour might mean to the children who are then going to be using those resources and looking at those resources. So this is sort of where we found ourselves in this collaborative lesson research, that we were talking about using counters, and we were all, yep, that's great, that's what we're going to use. And when we walked into the classroom, I took one look at the tables and thought, that isn't what I thought we were talking about. And it resulted in children doing this sort of thing. So just have a little look. It's not, I apologise, it's not a very clear picture, but this was a pair of children looking at setting out 2 rows of 10 to go with 2 rows of 10 chairs. So this was their model of 2 rows of 10 chairs. And I think there's a whole number of things you might notice about this. So first of all, one of the things I'm going to point out to you is that the fact that there are some white counters in there doesn't help you distinguish between being able to see those complete rows very well. So having counters that are the same color as whatever you're working on is probably not very helpful if you're wanting me to see something here. There's lots of different colors in there. So what am I attending to? Where am I supposed to be attending? Well, what I'm supposed to be attending to is these are equal groups. And what would allow me to know that would be the rows are the same length. But what you'll notice is they're not the same length. And why are they not the same length? Because the counters aren't the same size. So the bit of mathematics that we were trying to start looking at, the core of that bit of mathematics was about having equal groups, equal rows. And the resource, because we hadn't had that talk and the whole thing around the size of the counters as well as the color of the counters, it was not easy to see that those were equal groups. So it came up in the post-lesson discussion. It was one of the things that people really walked away with, which was actually, wow, we really need to think about the resource when we're going to use it, and colour might be a factor in that. And it prompted me to tweet about it, actually, and I had a little exchange with Jeff Wake about colour and resources. And then we had an opportunity to run a little project around this. So I worked with the Jurassic Maths Hub, and we ran a research project in 2018-19 looking at the use of colour to support understanding in mathematics. We had teachers from EYFS through to post-16 working as part of that group. And I worked closely with Neil Vincent, who's now the senior lead link for Jurassic Maths Hub, and he works at Woodruff School. So he worked with the secondary and post-16, and I worked with the primary and the EYFS. And as a whole group, we came together and we identified that there were 3 different contexts where you might use colour as a teacher to enhance the learning. So one was within resources, the manipulatives, which is what I've just been sharing with you. Another was a teacher using it in board work to draw attention to and expose structure and connections. And then a third way was pupils themselves using it in their own work, in their own recordings, again, to show the connections they were making and their understanding of the mathematics. And I'm going to focus on the first of those today. So you may be interested in those other two as well. And there is a little, a sort of a little paper that it's a very short paper that summarizes the work from the group that I'll share at the end of this. But I'm going to focus just on the first one of those, the resources one. So that's what we did. If you'd like to just read that slide. And I'm going to say at the outset that the strongest thing that we found, and the thing that I think struck us all, you know, as being the most significant, was how often we thought the children were going to see something within the manipulatives we were using, and particularly because of our very conscious use of colour, and they did not see what we thought they would see. And the only way that we knew what they saw was to actually ask them. So I think we all came away with going, we make a lot of assumptions when we're using resources, and we're being very conscious about the colour as part of that use of the resource, that we think is how the children will see things. And then we found ourselves being surprised a number of times around that. So that we really need to go to the learners and say, what are you seeing, and build from there. And it might seem really obvious, but I think we use resources and manipulatives often without having that sort of conscious thought about what are they actually seeing. So it sort of led us to a research question. I've said that's what we're going to really focus on. So it led us to this research question: are we supporting understanding or just demonstrating our own understanding in the way that we're using colour? Actually, that research question runs across the board work as well as the manipulatives, but as I said, I'm just going to focus in on the use of manipulatives here. So let's just have a little look at sort of the sort of research and what we know. You read that again as well. So what we decided to do was we decided to do exactly that. We decided to focus on the most basic. So we focused mainly on counters and cubes, and looked at the use of colour within counters and cubes. So you'll see that my very small scale research is even narrower now, because we've brought this right down. We did do a little bit of looking at some of the structured research as well, the structured resources, but it was mainly around counters and cubes. But these are some of the things when we got together with the primary and early years teachers together at start, the questions that they were coming up with, and we were asking ourselves. So one of them is, does colour get in the way of seeing the whole if it's used to identify parts? And you've got two examples there. So one is going back to my arrow cards example. If you see 630 on the left, just modelled with white arrow cards, does that allow you to see that as 630, the 630ness of 630, and therefore the 63 tens within 630 more easily than when you've got two colours on the right? And does the two colours on the right really draw you towards that partitioning alongst place value lines, but get in the way of you seeing the 63 tens? It's a question when we didn't know, does it? That's our question. And I guess we had a conjecture that it might, and that was one of the things we were interested in. But this also comes down to something like using two plates in Numicon and understanding that together they represent 7. And I did some work on this prior to this project, where I was in conversation with a group of year 3 children, and they were using the fact that they knew 3 add 4 equaled 7 to think about subtractions they knew. So they told me that 7 subtract 3 equals 4. And I got a 3 and a 4 plate out and asked one child to explain that and to use the Numicon to sort of show and go along with their explanation. And they wanted a 7 plate as well. And what they were looking at doing, they just wanted to use it for parts of a number sentence, rather than seeing that the 7 within that 3 add 4, that 3 add 4 itself represented the 7. They weren't happy. They wanted the 7 plate to represent the 7. So the idea that you've got a 3 and a 3 add 4 equals 7, and we put the plates together showing that, I had children who were not happy it showed that unless they also had a pink Numicon 7 plate as well. So can we see the 7 there? Are we able to see that as 7 without putting a pink plate on top of it? Can we still see that 7? Or is the colour getting in the way of us seeing that? So we just wondered whether the colour gets in the way of seeing the whole when we use it to identify parts. And then these are some other sort of questions that we asked ourselves and things we wondered at the beginning. We wondered whether where colour is part of the resource, like Numicon and Cuisenaire, are we actually using the resource in the way intended? I referenced earlier about the green and blue rods and plates. They have a very definite purpose. There's a reason why those rods are blue and green. There's a reason why those plates are blue and green, but do we recognise that and do we use that in our teaching and make our learners aware of that? Or is it, you know, it's just a blue rod or a blue plate? We talked quite a lot, because we had early years and Key Stage 1 involved as well as Key Stage 2, about the fact there is a difference about when you're using a resource and when you're teaching with that resource and you are wanting to use it to model and expose structure, compared with when it's being used as part of provision. So it might be that you've got something that is just out there and it's in continuous provision, and the children themselves will be in control of anything that happens around colour. When you come to use that yourself in the teaching, you can take some control over that colour. So do you make some conscious decisions then about how you want to use it? And we were thinking about the fact that we're making deliberate decisions about using colour to support understanding. And if we don't acknowledge and recognise the presence of colour, and we don't take account of it, we are potentially building in another barrier. And that's part of what we sort of noticed. So I'm just going to share some of the things that we did, that we looked at with some children, and what happened when we did. So this was a very, very simple thing we decided to do with 2 different groups of children in reception. We had a pile of cubes and we had sort of groups of 3 or 4 children, and we said, can you get 7 cubes and put them on your paper so that we can easily see there are 7? Exactly the same question to both groups, and then they looked at each other's. But we very deliberately had this pile of mixed colours and this pile of yellow cubes, because we want to see, did they do anything different? And yes, they did. They did do something different. The children with the mixed cubes took longer to get their 7 because they were picking out the particular colours they wanted, and their attention moved from the 7 to the colour. So they were much more focused on leaning across and stretching to get the colour they wanted, gathering the ones they wanted. Now, we made a very deliberate decision in our pile of cubes as well. We'd asked them to get 7, and we made sure there was not 7 of any one colour. We made sure that there was only 6 of any colour, so that they would have to make a decision there as well. So another interesting thing would have been to see if we had put 7 of a single colour, whether children would have done that. What they tended to do was really, as I said, their attention then was on the group, not what they were making, really, on the group that was left, the cubes that were left in the middle of the table. Whereas the children in the second group, they'd no stretching, no leaning, they're all yellow, there's nothing to decide about the cubes. Their focus was all on getting the 7 and just counting those straight out. So they did the cubes nearest to them, and they counted 7 either into their hand or as a pile in front of them, and then put them on their paper. So there was a difference, and that might seem like a very small difference, but it's about where someone's attention is and where you want their attention to be. And if just in getting 7 cubes, we're affecting the attention by whether we have a single colour or a mixed group of cubes, then that probably indicates that we might be having an effect on attention in other situations as well. I'm not suggesting that you always want to have all yellow cubes in the middle. I'm saying there's a decision you're making, and it's being aware of that decision and the impact of that decision on the attention of the learners, and it's something to really think about. So the decision, the difference was that sort of, you know, am I focusing on which cubes I get? Am I focusing on getting my 7 cubes? And that's where it was different. when they laid them out on their papers, they did very similar things. So on the left is from the first group, and on the right is from the second group. So they all moved their cubes around, and they made arrangements where you could subitize parts of their arrangement. So you could see these two arrangements as a 3, 1 and 3 very easily. And that's the sort of way that the children described them. And one of the things we wondered about was whether, with the age of the children, they're still very much at that stage where they are seeing everything as individual. They're not necessarily seeing units made up of smaller parts as we start to build up, as we start to unitize going through. And we did wonder whether color becomes more problematic as you start to do that, because on the left, there's clearly 3 in that top row, and I can subitize that. It doesn't have a sense of being a unit of 3 to me that the 3 in the top row on the right does, because of that color factor. And so when we wondered whether we're starting to want to get that sense of unitizing and seeing it as a 3, one group of 3, whether that would become a factor as well. Many of our questions we did not actually manage to answer, so there's a lot of research that still needs to be done in this area. So working with year 2, we stuck with 7 as our number, and we decided they were familiar with the tens frame and with arranging counters on a tens frame. So we thought we'd use that structure, it was familiar, and we would put 7 counters out in these 4 different ways. So again, we made as a group some deliberate choices about what we wanted to show the children and why we were doing that. So you'll see we've very deliberately got one that's all one color. We've got one where it's, you know, they're sort of alternate. You've got the 2 rows as 2 different colors, and then a seemingly sort of like just a mishmash. There's no particular rhyme or reason to that bottom right one. So we asked the children these 2 questions. What do you notice, and which is easier to see at 7? And mainly what they talked about was seeing 4 and 3. So immediately we had focused on, oh, they're used to a tens frame, they'll see a complete row of 5 and the 2, and they'll know it's 7 because of the 5 and 2-ness of 7. And they did not focus on that at all. They saw the 4. And I think now when I look at this, I see the 4 much more strongly than I'm seeing the 5 along the top and the 2. And I think it's because we didn't put it on a tens frame structure, but we used that structure in the way we laid them out. There wasn't the frame underneath to give us the sense of the complete row. So we didn't have that, and that top row is too many to subitize. You end up doing some sort of counting or noticing 2 groups and adding them together. You have to do a bit of work for that top row, whereas you can just see the 4 on the left and you can just see the 3, and that's something that actually we can do without having to do any additional work to see the 4 and see the 3. So that was our first surprise with that. Again, it was nothing to do with color, and one of the things that happened to us quite a few times with this project was we discovered things that weren't necessarily to do with color, but our exploration of color revealed things to us. So one of the children said that they liked the top left one the most because they found it easiest. They liked that 4 with the 2 reds and the 2 yellows. They liked it. It wasn't really necessarily what it is. It was what they liked, which became sort of, I think, a phrase that came through quite a lot. Just sort of look and see if there's any. They talked about, you know, finding out by doing things like counting in 2, but when we talked about that sense of the 5 at the back, then they did think it was easier to see the 5 in one color. Once we'd established that 5 on the back, and they liked the 5 in one color, and then the 2 in the separate color. So the bottom left one was the one that they then preferred because it made clear that 5, the complete 5, and then they could see that 2 as a separate part of it more clearly than when it was all one color. And there was definitely something that started to emerge from working with the year 2 children around positioning when you are putting resources together and spaces between and what that allows you to see. So that top right one, which might seem quite clear to us, it's a complete row of 5 and then 2 underneath and it's all one color, so there it is. Everything's very close together. And what the children started to describe to us and tell us was actually they were finding it really hard to distinguish between parts of it. So it starts to just look like a lot of counters when it was one colour. And that was a surprise to us. We then asked them to, oh, I'm actually going to show you, sorry, because we had this conversation about the fact we hadn't used a tens frame underneath, we then used an ice cube tray, which is, you know, a lovely tens frame that you can put things into, and we used that to make some sense of the 7, and they thought it was easier. And one of the things they talked about was because it was spaced out. So I think this is really interesting, and again, it's really interesting just in the context of tens frames and different things you might use as a tens frame. These things like ice cube trays that give you that very much a separation of the 5 along in each row. There is something there that kind of the children were saying that helped them to see and understand that there are 5 individuals making that row of 5, rather than it just being this sort of collective mess that they were seeing otherwise. What another child mentioned then when we put them on in the actual sort of a tens frame like this was they talked about that it really drew their attention of 7 in relation to 10, and they said they weren't seeing 5 and 2. What they were seeing was 10 subtract 3, and that was quite interesting. She did say she didn't like that, because she didn't like subtraction, which again, you get all these sort of emotive things that start to come into the discussion. But interesting that obviously with the tens frame there, it does obviously draw your attention to the number in relation to 10. Without it, you lose that sense of the 5-ness of the 5 in the top row. Sometimes you lose the spacing, and also it's not showing you in relation to 10. So just some really interesting things there. We then asked the children, having looked at this, to show us 9 in a way that it was easy to see there were 9. And this is what the 3 children in this group did. Let's have a look, just give you a moment to have a look at what they did. So really interesting, because they did 3 different things, and their attention was on different things. So I just want to look at this one first of all. I don't know if that looks to you like this child has just sort of picked up any old counters and put them down, but that is not what they did. They did this in a very considered way, and they did attend to colour in what they were doing. What they did was they counted the counters in 2s. So they got 2 black counters, 2 green counters, 2 blue counters, not the same blue, but 2 blue counters, 2 orangey red counters, and then they got 1 white counter. But what they didn't do was use that when they laid them down in the 9. But they used a structure for 9 that is a really easy structure for seeing there's 9. But the confusion of the counters, the other children, when they were looking at it, were saying that makes it really difficult to see the 9 because of all the different colours. And they said this would be much better. And they did the same structure, but they used colour to expose something that they knew. They knew those 2 rows of 3 were 6. That's a familiar dot pattern from dice and dominoes and things like that. So they were very familiar with that. And then they chose a separate colour to show that additional 3. So what this child had done was taken the structure that the first child had laid their counters down in, but then said you can use colour in a better way to show the 9 within that, by using the colour to expose the 6 that you recognise and the 3 that you recognise, and then knowing the 6 and the 3 making the 9. So again, I think there's something about colour where we can make assumptions about what children are seeing, on whether they're using colour or not. When we watched the child who did the counters on the left, we thought that they hadn't attended to colour, but by actually sort of watching back and looking more closely and also talking to the child, we realised they really had paid attention to colour. But the colour doesn't expose anything around the structure. There's almost like 2 competing things going on in the way they've laid it out there. And then the other 2 children kept something the same from the way that we'd laid out 7, and then changed one aspect of it. So they both kept the fact that they liked having 1 row in one colour and the other row in a second colour, because that had been something they said was really helpful when we'd laid the 7 down. But have a look and notice what they've done, how they've adapted the 7 to make the 9, because they've both basically taken 7 and changed it to make 9. So the child in the middle has kept the 5 and then carried on and added 2 in the row underneath. And that fits with the sort of familiar tens frame, isn't it? If those had been on a tens frame, you would have put 2 more on the bottom row, and that shows you the 9. You've got that 1 missing before you get to 10, and that sort of really links with that. What the child on the right did was they extended the top row. So they made the top row 7 and the bottom row 2. And one of the things we then talked about, and the children talked about, was it was really hard to see the 9 because on the right hand side, because it was really hard to see the 7 without counting in ones. It wasn't something you could just see. You needed to actually do some work to get to the fact that it was 7. One child said, it's hard to see. I think it would be 6 or 8. So that, you know, it was actually 7, but so it was quite a good, but it's, you know, looking at it going, I'm going to have to do something to work this out. So they liked the other 2 arrangements, but the 9 arrangement with the 2 colours, they preferred that. So there's an awful lot here that we thought about. There's assumptions around being able to transfer the structure of the tens frame to a situation where it's not there. 5 is too many in a row to be able to just know how many are there unless it's on that frame. And we were also interested then in looking at a different type of tens frame. So the next bit of work we did was we looked at Hungarian tens frames, and those, if you're not familiar, organize the 5s like 5 dots on a dice. So you have 2 5s to make your tens frame, like the dice dots on 5 dice dots, rather than 2 rows of 5. So we wondered whether that arrangement would be one where if you didn't have the board but you arranged the counters, it holds its structure better, that the children can recognize without counting better. We were interested in that, but we were also interested in this use of color again. So we did a very similar thing. We did 4 different arrangements of 7. 7 was clearly our magic number as we were working on this. And we just put all four of those up. One of the things we also did was we moved from working on the horizontal plane to the vertical plane, because we realized children were seeing different things. And when you move things up into the vertical plane, we've all got a shared view. So again, this was another thing that we ended up talking about, and it's all relevant to when we are sharing and presenting and looking at representations of mathematics. What's the plane in which we're viewing it? Where am I looking at it from? Am I seeing the same as you? So you can see these are all up on a board, and we've arranged them. And again, you'll see different things we've done with colour. And we just said, what do you notice? Because that's the question we needed to ask to find out. And the first thing that happened was one child said, oh, I see 6 and 1, and they did this. So then the other children did this and went, oh yeah, I can see 6 and 1. And focusing on the top right hand one, particularly the blue counters. And again, we had not anticipated that. In our heads, we had very clearly got a 5 on the left hand side. We had talked quite a lot about the gap between the 5 and the 2, and then we put the 2. But the children did not see that gap. And I think when you look at it now, in fact, the gap in that top row, there's a bigger gap between the first and second counter than there is between the second and third. We had looked at the 5 as a whole and then thought gap to the 2, but they didn't see that. Again, they were seeing there's a lot of blue counters there, but if I do that, I can see 6, but I really recognize that because it's those 2 rows of 3 again. And then there's one in the middle, the 6 and the 1. Eventually someone did say about the 5 from the dice, but they didn't like all the blue ones. They said it's a lot of counters. I can't see them. And what I had to do was really move the 2s away for them to start to see the 5 and the 2 actually in all of them, so that it became a much more defined gap between the 5s and the 2s. So that sort of 5 and 2. So there's a really big thing here that's not just about colour. It is around space around. If I'm wanting you to see part of an image as a unit, I want you to see that 5 within the 7. How much space do I need around that 5 for you to see it as that unit, and not just to see it as part of a bigger thing with the 2? So that was something that we sort of asked ourselves quite a lot. They talked about it being too bunched up. Just sort of found that little quote there, too bunched up. So when we did space them out, we then just started looking at the fives, because we just thought it was interesting to see the fives. These were the 3 5s that we were looking at, and we asked them, you know, which one's easiest to see there are 5. And you might be looking at those now and deciding for yourself which one you think it's easiest to see there are 5. All the children agreed on this top left. It wasn't the single colour. They all recognised this 5 arrangement as being the 5 pattern on dice. It wasn't that it wasn't unfamiliar to them. They all absolutely recognised it. But what they explained to us was that the one in the top left was easier to recognise because it's 4 and 1. And we started to realise that there's again, we make assumptions here that when children recognise and they tell you it's 5, we think they're seeing that 5 as a 5. It's a unit of 5. And all of these children were telling us they know it's 5 because it's 4 and 1. They're using the 4 and 1, and they liked the representation that really highlighted the 4 and 1, because that really made it clear to them that it was 5. And so again, they were very, very happy. They never talked about the 4 arranged in a square as anything but 4. So that was a very fixed understanding of structure of 4. But for 5, it became 4 and 1. And the teachers we were working together, we had EYFS teachers and Key Stage 1 teachers in this group. And one of the EYFS teachers said, oh, my children are really good. I don't think they'd say that. We got some year 2s who saying, I don't think they'd say that. And we were in her school. So when we'd finished working with the year 2 children, she went and got one of her reception children and brought them in. And we showed them we just showed them the single colour 5. And we said, you know, so how many? And she said that the child said there's 5, 4 and 1. So it seems to me that when we think children are recognizing something as a unit, they may not be recognizing what we think they are. They may be seeing the parts within it that allows them to know that. And again, that's sort of just an interesting thing that we found out there. So we then went on to ask those children that we looked at the Hungarian tens frame with to show us 9. And so we've got some quotes from there. And again, this is quite interesting because they've used that arrangement they all liked on the left, then changed the colour to the right to that very familiar 4. And then one of them says, well, it'd be better if all the same colour were together, which they had been saying was not helpful, particularly sort of previously. So that sort of their own use of colour then became quite interesting for them to try and show the structure of 9. But they found, building on the Hungarian structure of that 5 like a dice, much easier than the children that had worked with the tens frame where it's the rows. But we did have the 9 being shown like we had the 9 in the previous group as 3 rows of 3. And there's some sort of quotes about why they thought that was easy. So I'm not going to sort of talk too much more. I'm going to sort of just do a very quick look at looking at the some of the structured resources. We did have somebody who did this sort of thing, and it brought up a whole nice discussion. They were very familiar with Numicon, so they were very much sort of making links between the arrangements and how they fitted with the Numicon structure. And this child has started with 10 and taken away 1. And then another one says it would be easier if the yellow counters were all moved into one line. And they started to sort of think about how colour made it easier for them to see the structure that somebody else was trying to show them. So these are some of the sort of questions and some of the thinking arising from our discussion. How does spacing within an image have an impact on what the children see and notice? And that's been one of the things that I've really taken with me from this little bit of work. What are the children actually seeing? What do you notice, or what do you see? Just asking that before we start trying to build on something, because we need to sort of know rather than assume. So 4 arranged in a square, that's 1 part. 5 arranged was always seen as 2 parts, the 4 and the 1. But seeing 5 as 4 and 1, the children then started making connections between the dice pattern and the Numicon arrangement of 5. And that was a really, really interesting thing, that they really made quite a strong connection there. So just as we start to have just a couple of minutes, I'm looking and I'm already sort of at the end of my time really, but I'm just going to go a couple more minutes. Thinking about structured resources. And whether you're using the same colour or different colours, and what the impact of that is, and also how you lay that resource out. So we have two things that keep going on here. One is making conscious decisions about the use of colour, and then the other is how you then present the resource, how you put the resource down for children to look at. So here is 18. One of our teachers did this with their children again, saying, you know, just which one is it easiest to see 18 with? And where do you get the sense of that 18-ness of 18? And what are you getting in the others? You know, are you getting both the 10 and 8 and the 18-ness of it, or are you just getting a 10 and 8 sort of view of it, or a 10 and a sort of a random? So that was sort of something we were quite interested in. So we did do some work with some year 5s where we looked at colour, and we looked at colour both in what we were recording and trying to use that to expose structure, but we also used the different resources the school had, and we looked at giving children a different resource each, where colour was used differently, and getting them to reflect on that. So here you've got an example of, we were looking at the number 1,300, and we wanted them to be able to explain that number in different ways, including 1300s. So you can see that we've chosen to write there the 13 in one colour and the zeros in another colour, to expose that 1300-ness of that number. And you'll see the 3 resources that the children had. We had the classic with the mixed colour base 10. We had the classic thing where one child asked about the value of the large cube. Is it 1,000? Is it 600? And they weren't sure. So that could have happened with either of the sets. But the challenge was for them to make sense of 1,300 in their resource. And the resource where they found they could do that the easiest was the middle one, where it was the base 10 all of one colour. They seemed to connect the hundreds and the thousands much more easily where it was the same colour. And also because the base 10 has its value there, it's embedded in the size of the pieces, unlike the place value counters. They found that much easier to make that sense and make that connection. So I just want to give you a moment to just have a little read of this. It came from looking at the structured resource. Very much as I said. The last point I think is really interesting, and this goes for learning generally in mathematics and probably in other subjects as well, but when you're using language connected to new thinking, it can sometimes make you question language you've been using comfortably, because you're trying to work out, how does this new language fit with previous language? I found that on my own research on my own children when they were very, very young. We were finding it with year 5s. I don't think that's an unusual thing, but it's a thing to be aware of. Sometimes you sort of think, oh, they've suddenly got very wobbly over something I thought they were secure with. It's because they're trying to attach this new learning, this new bit of understanding, and work out how that fits with what they already thought. And so that was quite interesting. So in this session, it came out in some of the decimal language popping up. So they were saying hundredths rather than hundreds, and that's because they were working on decimals in their maths lessons, and so they were grappling with that language and how they made sense of that language and where that sits in the number system. It wasn't surprising then that started to pop up when we were talking about hundreds and tens and things. So we went back to some research here, and I just want to say that all of these things emerged through the research that we did, our little research project, although we were focused on colour. This is looking at what makes mathematics manipulatives effective. And you've got these 4 general principles. So consistently over a long period of time. And the consistency for me includes consistency around colour. So if you've got purple base 10 in year 3, and it's all single colour, why in another class have you got it all mixed up and lots of different colours? And one of the things, I'm not sure if I put it on a slide, but one of the teachers said they basically went away and started doing a bit of an audit and sorting out all their resources and thinking about what colour means. And base 10, you're supposed to be making connections between those different parts. I'm not sure how you do that when your ones are 5 different colours and they're just, you know, and then you've got a different colour 10s to, like, some children will manage that, but I think we're putting in extra barriers, and we're actually making it less accessible by doing that. So one of the things about colour can become a barrier. It won't become a barrier for every child, but we need to minimize the barriers for all children. And that's where I think it's really relevant. Again, they said this thing about avoiding manipulatives that resemble everyday objects or have distracting, irrelevant features. I'm going to suggest to you that sometimes colour is a distracting, irrelevant feature, and it is one thing to really think about. So this is where we ended up. Making conscious decisions about using colour and using it to expose structure, and starting from what the pupils notice, what they see, and then building on that to see how it aids their understanding. And I'm just going to finish with a few reflections from teachers that I worked with. I really love this. We're now moving from considering how manipulatives could be used to develop understanding to consider how the presentation and provision of manipulatives can develop understanding. That might seem very subtle, but that's for me, that's quite a big sort of step to be taking. I think this is the teacher that was having a look and sorting out their resources. You can have a PDF of these slides after today, if that's useful to you. This is a teacher who was really interested in how, if you've got vari-coloured structured resources, it might stop you seeing the whole number and focus you just purely on the parts. And I think it's very interesting because we get a lot of children who compare it to you that 132 is 100 and 3 tens and 2 ones, but that sort of sense of the fact that it is also 132 ones is kind of lost within that, and yet it's such a fundamental part of the understanding. And sometimes I wonder whether colour is one of the reasons why that's happening and the experiences they're having with the manipulatives they're using. And that's, I think, quite a big find. As children are seeing those differently, we need to spend more time finding out what they are, so we get a shared understanding. If that way that we are representing, that we're modelling with a resource using colour to expose structure, if that is actually going to do that for the children that we're working with. So these are our key questions. Are we supporting understanding or just demonstrating our own? What do the pupils see? Does colour get in the way of seeing the whole if it's used to identify parts? And does that leave pupils thinking of things like addition as input and output, the 3 and 4 equals 7 with the numicon, rather than an equivalence idea? We wondered whether when you use 2 colours, that the children are looking to notice something, and then the moment you go beyond 2 colours, that goes. And spacing, that became quite a big thing for us. And I can send you a PDF of this. This was our little write-up of the whole project, where we did also, as I said, have teachers working on board work and things like that as well. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, and then I'll have a look at chat. We've got a number of things in chat. Let me stop recording first of all.